happy to do it. Hello, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Sterling Hubbard. I'm a third-year counseling psychology doctoral student and one of Dr. Vogel's students. And I'm happy to be here and happy to welcome you all tonight. Before we get started, I will do a couple of announcements, but we like to start with the land acknowledgement. Iowa State University is located on ancestral lands and territory of the Bokosi or Iowa Nation. The United States obtained the land from the Meskwaki and Sauk nations in the Treaty of 1842. We wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, and to the 17,000 Native Americans who still live here today. We would like to thank the co-sponsors of tonight's talk, Liberal Arts and Sciences and Committee on Lectures, which is funded by the student government. And a few housekeeping items. There will be an opportunity to ask Dr. Vogel questions. Please note that there is a microphone set up in the front of the room for you to use. Please do not use any flash photography if you want to take pictures. If you leave before the Q&A is finished, please exit quietly and refrain from talking until you leave the room. A lectures program student worker will be in the hall outside the room to scan your IDs if you are here for class credit. Card scanning will not start until the lecture is finished. And I would like to briefly announce the upcoming event. Tomorrow, March 27th, Iowa State University will host alumna Marna Yandu Nelson will give her lecture, Protecting Plant Surfaces in a Changing Climate, Understanding Synthesis, Form and Function of the Plant Cuticle Using Corn Skills as a Model System. Her talk will be at 11 a.m. in room 2630 of Memorial Union. All lecture events are free and open to the public. A full schedule is available on the lectures program website. And now here is our Dean, Beata Schmidtman, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Well, thank you so much. And good evening. I'm Beata Schmidtman. I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Iowa State University. And it is my true pleasure to be your host for this special event. This evening's lecture is the 36th in the lecture series, which highlights faculty excellence and achievement in teaching, research, and outreach in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Exceptional members of the LAS faculty are invited to present lectures from their own diverse areas of scholarship. They're faculty members who help solve global challenges, connect the world with art and culture, and push the boundaries of educational and intellectual dialogue. Our topics have ranged from the exploration of oxygen-free lakes to new approaches in cancer treatment, to the war in Ukraine. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I do want to acknowledge the ISU Lectures Program for their help, for their role in helping us sponsor and coordinate this event. And I also really want to thank everyone from the LAS team who was involved in making tonight's lecture possible. This partnership heightens our ability to share the college's contributions with the community, and it is greatly appreciated. Now, at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce David Vogel, professor in the Department of Psychology and the director of our Communication Studies program. In his research, Dr. Vogel focuses on the barriers to seeking mental health treatment. In his lecture, he will discuss one of the key barriers that keeps people from getting the help they need, namely the stigma associated with seeking help and how we might reduce it. According to the World Health Organization, mental health concerns affect 13% of the global population and will cost the world economy approximately $6 trillion by 2030, more than the projected cost of cancer, diabetes, and chronic respiratory disease combined. Yet, the National Center for Health Statistics reports that less than 10% of those experiencing mental health concerns seek therapy every year. And those who do seek help often wait years before doing so, or they drop out of treatment early. LAS research truly does transform the world by addressing the challenging issues of our time, and Professor Vogel is no exception. His research has been supported by the National Institute of Mental Health, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the American Psychological Foundation, and the Military Suicide Research Consortium. Please join me in welcoming the Spring 2024 LAS Distinguished Lecturer, Professor David Vogel.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. In starting to talk about stigma and help seeking, I think it's important to share our own stories and journey. And so I'm going to start off with a story of my own experience today. And I think the story will kind of mirror our talk today. We'll start off a little sad, but then have a kind of an ending that kind of brings some hope or direction for the future. The sad part of the story is my mom died about 5 years ago. And as I was processing my grief and my sadness around her loss, I recognized that there were some thoughts or beliefs I had about myself and what was appropriate to feel. We think about experiencing grief, and we think we all go through that at some point in our lives. And so is it normal if I'm still feeling sad or crying after a week, a month, a year? What is sort of the expectation, or how should I be feeling? I noticed that some of those beliefs on what's sort of normal or abnormal or appropriate were further enhanced about some of the messages I've received about being a man. Men, as we grow up, often get messages such as boys don't cry, and that we're supposed to man up and deal with things. We're supposed to be in control of our feelings, particularly around sadness or depression. So as I was feeling my feelings and sadness, some of those thoughts was it okay? Should I be having those? Shouldn't I just be able to push through? I think some of these thoughts were further exacerbated by my professional roles as a counselor and teacher. I help others. Am I the one that's supposed to need help? I know what we're supposed to do. Why can't I just sort of help myself to follow those same directions or advice that I'd give others? As I was processing those feelings, I did start to reach out to some family, my wife, my brother, my dad. And I started to reach out to some friends who had gone through losses of their own. And I started to not only get support and some normalization for some of the process I was going through, but I also got some messages that counteracted some of those beliefs, that made it okay to have whatever feelings I was having, to be whatever place I was at. And also that it's okay to ask for help, both from them and from a professional. And when I decided to actually seek help from a therapist, I was able to further process some of my feelings of loss and grief. I was also able to recognize some of the patterns and some of the things that I missed with my mom gone. Some of the things I hoped was that there were some things I wish I'd been able to share with her, and I wouldn't be able to share, or at least have her respond to that sharing anymore. And that allowed me to recognize that there were other people in my lives that maybe I wanted to share things with while they were still here and could respond. And as a result, I always had a good relationship, for example, with my dad and my brother. You know, we talk once a year, but now we talk every few weeks or every month. We share things back and forth, and we'll text in between. And I feel much more able to reach out to them and share what's going on in my life or troubles I'm having. And so we have a little closer relationship than we had before. And that's kind of our hope for the talk today. Is we'll start off with some of the statistics around the prevalence of mental health issues. We'll talk about some of the barriers, in particular stigma, and then we'll kind of focus on changing it to kind of improve our relationship and improve our experiences going forward. Overall statistics generally say that about 1 in 5, or about 20% of individuals currently experience a mental health issue or a mental health concern. Lifetime prevalence is closer to 50%, meaning that all of us in the room, or half of us in the room, will experience a mental health issue, and all of us in the room will have friends or family who are experiencing it. So it's going to touch all of us either directly or indirectly. In recent years, with a lot of the stressors out in society, there's been an increase, as much as maybe 25% on average, and with some groups, particularly younger individuals, as much as 50%. Some of the statistics around college students, for example, say there's about a 50% increase in recent years. As mentioned by the dean earlier, the National World Health Organization estimates that currently there's $1 to $2 trillion a year spent or lost to mental health issues, and this could rise to as much as $6 million in 2030. Also, a particular concern is not only the prevalence, but also sort of our ability to get help when we need it. On average, less than 50% of individuals get any type of help or support or mental health services. This includes both medication and therapy or counseling. And medication tends to be about 3 to 1 or more use, so closer to about 10, or it's up a little bit, 10 to 15% of individuals seek therapy or counseling. The vast majority of others have treatment, usually with medication only. A lot of that medication treatment is through general practitioners, who often are either the source that individuals go to see first, or maybe now they often do like screenings for depression or other things, so they may be picking up some of the cases. With less than half of individuals getting any treatment, and a much smaller percent, around 10 or so, actually getting time for therapy. One of the surprising statistics when I first read it, I had to reread it several times because I didn't believe it, but individuals of any type of mental health services often have a delay of about 10.5 to 11 years before they seek those services or get the treatment, leading to increased distress and undue sort of suffering in sort of the meantime. And of those that do seek help or have some type of mental health services, about 1 in 5 or 20% of those will drop out of treatment early, not follow through with the treatment suggestions, or not follow through with the medication. Again, suggesting a large number of individuals aren't getting the full benefit. As we talk about some of the barriers, there are several layers to it. Stigma is the one we'll focus most on today, but there are structural barriers, such as access to care. That could be cost or having insurance. That could be travel. Iowa, for example, has one of the, I think, third or fourth from last in terms of number of mental health professionals, and often those are located in most of the urban or centers, and so individuals will need to travel a lot of times to get services they want those. With the advent or increase more recently of telehealth options, some of those barriers are removed, but they still can be a barrier in that you have access to good internet and a secure computer where you can maybe talk in private, and those aren't always options to people in all areas. There are also barriers to trust of the mental health system. Historically, a lot of marginalized groups have been overdiagnosed or misdiagnosed by the healthcare system, and so there may be some accurate trust or concerns about how treatment would be if they were to seek it. But one of the psychological barriers that still has a huge impact, even sort of accounting for all these other factors, is mental health stigma. The most common type of stigma that's discussed is public stigma. This is the societal or sort of external beliefs about the individual, often negative beliefs or negative views or assumptions about the individuals for having a certain label or being a part of or associated with a certain group. Traditionally, or most commonly, this public stigma is talked about in terms of having a mental health concern, so having depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. experiencing these mental health conditions are viewed negatively and often sort of with negative stereotypical judgments about the individual. Some of the most common ones that kind of persist today are viewing people who have a mental health concern as violent, unstable, dangerous, or incompetent. And these negative stereotypes are pretty generally inaccurate. People who have a mental health concern are actually much more likely to be the person who experiences violence rather than the one who actually does the violence. But we often have these notions because they're portrayed in the media or in society, and these messages we keep hearing or seeing get internalized as part of our view. The image I have up here of The Shining, I think there's a newer version now, but a classic one, where the main character is basically snowed in a hotel for a long period of time, and basically takes an axe and tries to kill his family. In this, some classic image, he takes the axe and bashes through a door where his wife's hiding behind as he's trying to get at her. These negative stereotypes then give rise to discrimination, less likely to offer a person a job, offer avoidance, less wanting to have contact or be close to the person. And this discrimination and social distancing then gives rise to increased experiences of distress and avoidance of wanting to let other people know what we're dealing with. And so we're less likely to engage or seek help or talk to another person about our experiences or ultimately even seek help from a professional, because doing so means that other people might start seeing us in these negative terms, which we'd like to avoid. Some of our own work we've done here has also focused on ideas. Not only is there a stigma associated with having a mental health concern, but there's also a corresponding stigma associated with seeking help for those concerns. And so we might be seen even worse if not only am I experiencing the grief, but if I'm experiencing the grief and I can't just push through it, then there's something wrong with me. And some of the labels or stereotypes out there are things that we're unstable, we're less confident, and we're inadequate. And so we're going to be seen as violent and crazy and unstable, and those are going to have compounding impacts if we let people know that we have experience that we're dealing with and that we're seeking help for it. These then lead to avoidance. Again, if we don't seek help or don't let people know what we're experiencing, then we won't elicit these labels. If we do elicit these labels, then we're more likely to experience distress. So the avoidance, in a sense, a protective mechanism, where maybe I'm not getting the benefit of talking to another person, but I'm also not experiencing the negative impact of letting others know. Particularly pernicious or particular concern is that not only are we necessarily aware of these public or external perceptions of ourselves if we were to have a mental illness or if we were to seek help, but over time we come to internalize those, and for many of us we come to accept those as true of ourselves. In the story I started off with, a lot of the things that were going through my head in the decision to seek help wasn't whether someone else was going to see me negatively, but it was that self-talk I was having is, was I okay? And so it's this internalized message that we have of, I'm going to see myself as unstable, I'm going to see myself as incompetent, I'm going to see myself as inferior, that then comes to both increase the level of distress if I think of myself in that category, and it's going to have the biggest impact on our behavior. Visually, you can kind of see this as the public stigma is internalized as self-stigma over time. And we've done some studies showing how over a period of months and even years, this process can happen. And as we said, the beliefs then we have about ourselves are that we are inferior, inadequate, or weak. And that this then leads to the biggest impact on behavior. In one qualitative study, one person, I think, kind of summed this up pretty well by saying that once you go to seek help, it's like you admit that it's now a part of me, that now something that I have to deal with. It's almost like changing your identity. And we'll come back to this idea of identity when we talk about interventions to change or sort of improve stigma or lessen its impact. But this notion of I'm going to want to protect myself from this negative perception, from this change of identity, is one of the key barriers to our willingness to seek help. We want to avoid that. Graphically, a lot of our research is sort of focused on the different ways this process happens. So public stigma is going to impact help-seeking behaviors through this self-stigma. Then as the self-stigma is fully mediating or fully accounting for the relationships between these external perceptions and our decision-making. Some of the research most often kind of focuses on the most proximal barrier, attitudes, but they've also focused on our willingness to then actually seek help or our intent to seek help. We've also done a number of studies looking at self-stigma impacts our decisions to gather more information. In this one study, we actually assessed individuals' self-stigma and then gave them a choice to go to a counseling, click on a website or click on a link to go to a website to learn more about the counseling center and what its options were. And the higher level of stigma, the less willing you were to actually click on that link and find out more about the counseling center at the university. Similarly, we gave them a depression screening inventory and then asked them if they'd be willing to find out the results. The higher the stigma, the less willing they were to get the results. So it's impacting a lot of the decision points along the way to us kind of taking that bigger step of actually making the call or going online and making an appointment with someone. And in today's world, a lot of us, sometimes we have an issue and we think it's strong enough, we just make an appointment with our doctor. A little bit easier now, they can sometimes just make the appointment online. But for most of us, we have a symptom and we Google it. And we're like, what does this mean? Is this serious? Should I just ignore this? Can I just ignore this? But if you're not even willing to take the step to gather the information, right, that's going to hold us back from taking the bigger step in many cases. In another study, we worked with nurses who were implementing follow-up to cancer survivors. After cancer survivors were a couple of months out from their final treatment or their last treatment, they kind of followed up to do a check-in to see how they were doing. And in that study, they often, or in that outreach, they often would make a referral for the person if they noticed they were experiencing distress or other issues. What we found is that only about a third of people accepted the referral, and of those who accepted the referral, who didn't accept the referral, their self-reports of stigma was a key aspect of that. As we'll come back in subsequent studies, we tried some additional interventions to increase the likelihood of that acceptance. And then we've done longitudinal work showing that stigma sort of impacts our ultimate actual use of mental health services over like a 2-year period. Even though when we initially go to services or go to therapy, it doesn't mean that the stigma or those fears go away. It means that either they were lessened a little bit or the symptoms maybe were strong enough I felt I should make the appointment. But I'm still kind of concerned that what does this mean about me? What does it mean if someone else finds out I'm here? So we've actually followed clients who started therapy and kind of assessed the impact on their willingness to continue treatment and some of the outcomes. In this first example, we assessed people's self-stigma while they were in the waiting room to see their therapist. And those individuals in the waiting room that reported higher levels of stigma actually saw that the upcoming session was likely going to be less beneficial. They also reported greater risks with associating or self-disclosing to their therapist. So they were actually less willing to tell their therapist things because it seemed riskier, that maybe the therapist would believe all those negative thoughts that we're believing in our own head. And that led to their reported less willingness to actually self-disclose information to the therapist. In another study, we actually assessed their self-stigma over time throughout the course of therapy. And we found that as their stigma kind of persisted to some level, and the degree to which it persisted, it actually led to a less close relationship with the therapist. And the relationship with the therapist, or what they often talk about at the Working Alliance, is one of the key factors for whether therapy is effective. That if we have a close, collaborative connection with our therapist, therapy tends to be more effective. In this case, self-stigma was inhibiting or lessening that relationship, and then ultimately lessening the outcome or the effectiveness of therapy. We also assess their level of distress at any given day. So at every given session, we measure both self-stigma and distress. And both self-stigma and distress vary day to day. Even if we're having greater distress on average in our lives, some days will be a little bit better, other days will be a little bit worse, and there'll be variations along that. What we found is days when we were feeling a little worse, the impact of self-stigma was strongest. That's the days at which we're kind of most needing that support, or most needing to sort of work with a therapist, were the days we're actually most likely to feel the stigma and pull back, not self-disclose, and not get the relationship or the connection or outcomes as we wanted. I mentioned briefly on the previous slide that we've assessed self-stigma over time. The good news is that for individuals that go to therapy, self-stigma does decrease after a session. So we do feel a little bit better. But the degree to which the stigma does persist, it actually still influences whether or not we're willing to come back. And as we talked about a little earlier, 20% of individuals drop out of therapy. So not only is it impacting sort of the initial decisions, but then once we go, it's accounting for at least some of that 20% that drop out, because it's still influencing our decisions to come. And then over a 2-year period, we showed that there were fewer sessions overall, the greater the stigma was. So we need to both intervene initially to increase the option for people to go to therapy if they want, and to, as therapists, need to continue to pay attention to it and to be addressing it as we work with clients. Now we get to move in some of the more positive aspect and directions for the future. Traditionally, there has been a number of approaches that have started working on decreasing stigma. Most of this focuses, as we alluded to a little earlier, on public stigma, and mostly on public stigma associated with mental health. But there is more research and interventions now focusing on self-stigma, and then most recently, starting to be a growing body of research around increasing sort of self-stigma around help seeking, though that's having the biggest impact on actual decisions. Most approaches focused on psychoeducation. These have the notion of kind of normalizing the experience of seeking help. Some of the things like with the story at the beginning, talking about our experiences, sharing what's going on, will make it something that it doesn't seem like I'm alone or it's just me. And so they're designed to provide information about the self-healing process and to normalize the overall act. One example I'll give you today is the Real Man, Real Depression campaign put on by the National Institute of Mental Health. As I briefly alluded to at the beginning, men often have messages that help seeking in particular is not consistent with the male gender role, and particularly seeking help for certain issues like depression are somewhat inconsistent. And so the Real Man, Real Depression campaign was designed to sort of counteract some of those messages. And on average, women seek help about 1.5 times greater rate than men. In particular, some of the messages consistent with what we're talking about today was changing or directly countering some of the negative messages that seeking help is a sign of weakness by describing it more as taking courage. And in particular, using images and stories of other individuals who have gone through the process to kind of normalize it. So the brochure and ultimately the website had multiple images of different men talking about their experiences with mental health and talking about their experiences seeking help. And it's hearing other stories, in particular people that we can connect with, that can help sort of reduce some of those messages. People have started talking and doing a little bit of research into other ways this can happen. The key when we're hearing someone else talk is that we feel connected to them, we feel some similarity to them. And a lot of times celebrities are someone that we connect to, we feel a connection to, we look up to, or feel positively towards. And so there's some discussion of a lot of celebrities coming out talking about their mental health experiences, and their experiences seeking help can be one way to start to change some of the media messages. And then more recently, some have looked into sort of the idea of social media disclosures and the influence that can have. And there has been some individuals who have talked more about their experiences through social media outlets, though it's still a relatively small percentage. In addition to having images sort of in the media or at the larger societal level, or even having websites or brochures, I think a lot of what changes the messages is having those around us give us messages that are sort of counter to that. So having a social network that approves or gives us positive messages around that. In one study we did, we looked at individuals who had sought help, counseling or therapy services. And 94% of those individuals knew of somebody who had sought mental health services themselves or sought therapy themselves. And about 74% or 75% of those individuals specifically had friends or family or others close to them suggest that they seek help. And so if one of the main pathways into therapy or counseling is having other individuals who have modeled it and who have suggested that it would be beneficial to us and given us positive or expressed positive messages that it is more courageous and it does take strength or it is helpful, rather than sort of the negative or opposite messages. At ISU, we also did a study recently, or had a campus-wide intervention that we sort of followed up that focused on sort of bystander training. So one of the ways to increase this social network is to recognize that a lot of times it's not only the individual themselves that we want to focus on, but recognizing how do we train people around them to respond in a way that's going to give those positive messages, that's going to make the positive referral to get that happen. And a lot of times these are talked about as sort of bystander trainings. The example we did here was called Respond, Partnering for Campus Mental Health. And it was put on by Student Wellness and the Student Counseling Center, funding from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Respond was an acronym that kind of spelled out the specific skills that we were trying to train others. In particular, these were staff and faculty who are most likely to interact with an individual or could possibly interact with an individual, and how to help them increase their confidence and skills in being able to respond in an appropriate or useful sort of way for the individual. A lot of times, faculty and staff may not always know how to respond in a way that's helpful, and so giving some of that training to increase those benefits can be helpful. So Respond sort of helps the person recognize signs of mental health concerns, how to respond empathically, share concerns, pose questions to gather necessary information, offer some initial hope, but maybe importantly for this discussion, also how to navigate resources or make those suggestions in a way that can be heard to help the person get the services that they need. And because sometimes this can be difficult, particularly if we're dealing with someone in acute distress. Also, how do we take care of ourselves afterwards? This little graph here showed that 1 week prior to the training, we sort of assess people's general confidence in their ability to respond in a helpful way to someone who was in distress. And it was relatively low on the scale. Right after training, they felt there was a 5-point scale, so a 4.3 or so. They were feeling much more confident, and that this confidence sort of maintained several weeks or about a month after the training and the follow-up. One of the key barriers, though, is that we know that sometimes these psychoeducational efforts and these trainings for both ourselves and those around us can be very beneficial. As we've talked about, one of the insidious effects of self-stigma is that it keeps us from even wanting to engage in the material. Right? We weren't clicking on the link to go to the counseling center to learn more about it. We weren't getting the results of the distress screen to know if we're distressed and therefore should follow up. So we're kind of resistant to taking those steps for fear of what's going to happen. And so we need to actually design the interventions in a way that kind of gets around or addresses those fears or those concerns that are present. And a lot of times, the very act of the intervention itself can have what they call rebound effects, where if I ask you to think about going to therapy, you're like, oh man, all my fears about being seen as incompetent or scared or inadequate are heightened. So we actually bring up the very thing we're wanting to reduce by trying to talk about it. And so one of the ways that we need to have effective therapies is recognizing or finding ways to sort of reduce some of those fears or concerns so the person will even engage in the intervention or engage in the information. One way that we're starting to envision this is based on self-affirmation theory. Self-affirmation theory is the notion that we have an innate desire to have a positive image. And we have an innate desire to want to protect that positive image in the face of sort of external information that kind of counteracts that. This is very consistent with what we're talking about is we're going to avoid therapy because therapy would make us feel inadequate, and I want to not feel inadequate. I want to still feel adequate, okay, stable, competent. And so to keep those confident feelings, I'm going to not approach this situation or this experience. However, one of the ways that we can increase sort of our resistance or willingness to face a scary experience is by self-affirming other aspects of our identity unassociated with the feared aspect. So if after this talk you wanted to come up and give me some information or some positive or some criticism about things I could do better, and you just came up and said, hey David, you know, in the middle there you kind of got a little soft and we couldn't really hear you for a while, and I'm like, okay, that's great, and I'm going to walk away because I just gave the talk and I don't really want to hear any feedback. If though you came up to me afterward and said, oh, you know, David, you know, I was talking to you earlier and I got this really great feedback, you know, about one of your friends felt really supported by you earlier today. Oh, and by the way, you know, I had this information about the talk. If I'm feeling really good about my friendships, then the information about the talk is okay. But I have to build up other aspects of our identity so that the other aspect doesn't seem to be so all-encompassing. If I as a person am larger than this one issue, this one aspect is less scary. A number of ways that we can elicit self-affirmations. The idea is that we have a full aspect for identity. Our aspect for identity can be things like group identities. Early on, we talked about one of my identities as a man has certain messages about help seeking, certain roles as a counselor or therapist, certain relationships or goals or beliefs all impact who we are. One aspect, though, that they found that we can elicit fairly easily and often is unrelated to the help-seeking process is values. And often we'll do this by having us writing a 5-minute talk or 5 minutes about certain values we hold, and then sort of thinking about how those values impact our lives. But even a 5-minute writing task is probably too long, right? We have to do something that's sort of very quick, very immediate, and elicits that so we can move right on to giving the feedback. You can't give someone depression screening, have them write for 5 minutes about their values, and then ask if they want the results. So we've played with some things. Some other people have played with some ideas where you could have just a rank-ordered task where you just kind of select a couple of things and maybe think about those with one question. Or in this one example, we had a list of values on the screen, and we had people just move over the 2 most important values to them. And even a very brief task like this does then elicit certain aspects of our identity that then has a somewhat protective impact on subsequent tasks. In this case, we found that different types of self-affirmation interventions had an initial impact on lowering stigma, increased our willingness to learn more, so we're much more likely to click on the link to go to the counseling center or to be willing to accept the depression screening information. It increased our willingness to self-disclose to another person or to the counselor. And we're having some evidence, though we're still kind of following up, on greater acceptance of the referral. So in the cancer follow-up we talked about with the nurses, we said about 30% of the individuals initially accepted the referral. When we followed the people up longer term, we found that of those 30% that accepted the referral, none actually went. But we actually then had this very brief self-affirmation intervention that the nurses are implementing before they make the referral. And we have a very small sample, so we're still kind of following it up, but we have about a double acceptance rate. And in this case, we're using what they call a hot referral, where we're not just saying, would you have a referral, here's the information, they're actually making the call right then. So behaviorally, they're actually making an appointment, and we can about double the impact, but the sample size is too small to fully assure that's the case. So the goal then is to figure out how we can further expand this. We talked earlier about how a lot of the times our first contact with the health field, the medical field, and ultimately the mental health services is through our medical practitioners, usually the GP or general practitioner. So can we do a very brief self-affirmation intervention in the waiting room or right before they do the depression screening that they're doing to sort of then increase the likelihood that we accept or follow through with that information. And then maybe we also need to do some trainings with the doctors, the nurses, on how they can actually make a referral that would be accepted so that they would actually sort of follow through. And then finally, I'll give you one other example of a possible intervention. Corrigan has this model. He's most popularized and sort of, I think, used the current terms, sort of public and self-stigma. And he has this model of how public stigma is internalized as self-stigma, where it starts off with sort of our awareness of these external stereotype or negative labels, and how we then come to believe them to be true or agree with them. And then to be fully internalized as self-stigma, we have to then sort of accept that they're true about us. And so one way to intervene is to intervene in this acceptance process and make it less likely that we accept that information as true. So we may recognize that society at large has this belief, but we may not necessarily believe or come to agree it's true about ourselves, which would then mitigate the possible harm or lowering of self-esteem or the avoidance as a result. And one example that some people have been focusing on are positive psychological approaches such as self-compassion interventions. Self-compassion is based out of sort of Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist ideas where that we come to accept or be aware of distress, but also recognize sort of our humanness and humanity, and recognize that it's okay to have that feeling, but to not necessarily then judge ourselves. So there's less judgment, and more sort of common human connectedness and human kindness. And some initial work we've been doing shows that self-compassion interventions can buffer some of these negative effects. This one study, again, focusing on sort of the internalization of these masculine roles. So in particular, some of the masculine roles are things like self-reliance and a less emotional expression or decreased emotional expression. And what we found is that the negative impact of kind of endorsing these traditional gender roles was lessened when we were compassionate. So the masculinity had less of impact on stigma when we had higher self-compassion as opposed to when we had lower self-compassion. So let's end off with a few more good pieces of news before we wrap up. The good news is overall self-stigma is decreasing. And so some of the interventions and some of the, I think, increased discussions around mental health are having an impact. And ultimately, the goal may be to change sort of public stigma so that it's just not even present, and then the whole chain is gone. But we probably need to focus on sort of both aspects in the meantime as we're kind of changing the process. Also, rates of help seeking are increasing, maybe coinciding with that. It also may be partly that mental health concerns are also increasing, but rates of help seeking are increasing along with the decrease of stigma. In particular, the rates of stigma are decreasing around more common mental health concerns, rather than some of the less common ones, but decreasing overall. However, there's still a treatment gap, as we talked about, and so we need to continue to identify ways to sort of decrease these barriers, such as self-stigma, before and after treatment, so we can continue to improve the benefits. Thank you. Feel free to come up and ask questions. I think the mic is on.
That was very nice, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you had one path model where you had all kinds of links with negative behaviors. Did you ever control for negative affectivity or neuroticism?
In a couple of the studies, particularly the studies where we actually measured behavior, so like your willingness to click on the link, we did actually control for like the PANAS or sort of negative and positive emotions in that study.
And the links persisted?
And the links persist in that
great,
case,
thanks.
yeah.
Hello, thank you.
Yes.
As friends, what steps can we take to make your friend go seeing someone if they don't want to on a daily
Yes.
basis?
So I think key is to just be, well, one of the first steps is just to be present and show support. And then to help normalize the behavior, and to make the referral or make the suggestion, and to also express how you're seeing them. So I said, we want to, in a sense, counteract some of those messages. So likely they'll have internalized some of the views that I won't be strong, I'll be weak. We want to sort of share how we're seeing them, and making it more explicit, that sort of our view of them, so that we're getting at least one other option. As in that one study, we showed that about 75% of people had someone make the referral, and in most of those cases, right, the referral from someone who was supportive, that was showing caring, showing that hope, and giving sort of some of those other messages. And same if you go back to my original story, right, it was getting those messages from friends and family, that it doesn't necessarily always happen just instantly, but as we keep getting those messages, it will start to change that discussion. I also hope longer term, as that becomes more normal, that we're all starting to talk about it, that it'll get easier to believe those. So one of the hard parts right now is, we may give them message, but if they're getting 5 other messages from other people or not getting any messages, they may be implying or reading into it that some of the negative ideas or attitudes. So it may take some time to build up that, but just keep providing that support, keep providing those messages to kind of counteract those, I think is key.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll ask a question. What's the sample that you use in terms of age?
Yeah.
Also I'm thinking about younger people, and also developmentally disabled people or challenged
Yeah.
people that have delayed development.
Yes.
Kinds of things.
We've a big chunk of the sample is college students, but we have many of the studies we've worked with children and young adolescents. We also have a number of studies with older individuals, and we have studies that have looked at different groups, different identity groups, different marginalized populations. We also have some work now where we're actually looking at cross-culturally how stigma plays out and have assessed stigma in about 10 to 15 different countries and to see how these processes play out. There are some variations. So for example, older individuals tend to actually have a little bit less stigma, but the stigma they have actually shows stronger links with their decision making. Individuals, young adults, middle-aged adults, tend to show the highest level, but also the weakest relationships. And the younger individuals tend to also show somewhat strong relationships, but kind of are in the middle of these others. Same thing, different individuals, different marginalized groups will vary depend upon the group. But on average, like Asian American individuals and actually individuals from a lot of Asian countries will show higher levels of stigma. But the relationships will vary depending upon the country. European and a lot of Western countries tend to show some of the strongest links. We actually have one current study we're doing. A lot of these stigma measures, both public and self, take a very Western or individualistic view. So a lot of these ideas we talked about as such, I perceive myself negatively or inadequate, is individualistic or often kind of Western kind of notion. A lot of individuals may not seek help because of fears of what that would say about my family or other people important to us. So we're also kind of assessing if that kind of more interdependent kind of view of the impact on others matters. So there are nuances to this that vary based on group that are very important to say, and I didn't go into all the details for time today, but there are variations that are uniquely important to pay attention to.
Sounds like you have a very large sample that you've
We've done about 100 studies. A lot of the studies, will have between 200 and 800 people in them. Many of them have multiple samples, and then we've reached out, to different populations and different groups to try to expand this as we continue to try to understand its nuances along that. And so I think it was a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
David, I was very intrigued by your RESPOND intervention, the psychoeducational intervention on a university campus. Who shows up to participate in the intervention? Is it those that volunteer? Are they urged to do so? Or
So in the first study, in the study that we did, we had about 300 individuals. And so it was mostly volunteers. They were given options to staff and faculty on campus to come, and then they were run in groups of 10 to 20 at a time. And so I think the notion would be is you'd want the largest group of the majority of people sort of trained eventually, but initially in the study there was just volunteers who were interested, which is one possible limitation that people that sign up for the study right away might be those who are most interested in the training and most likely to get information out of it. But I think in general still, the more we can train, more we can increase the comfort for all of us talking about these issues, I think the better impact it's going to have on reducing the larger stigma and increasing our ability to help that person who we're meeting, whether it's a friend, family, student, fellow staff member, or colleague. So I think the key is that we need to normalize having these discussions and helping us learning how to respond or act or react in a way. You know, if we are feeling less capable, we're more likely to not approach it or pull back or just wait till someone else responds who we think might have more skills. So the key is normalizing and making it something that we feel like we can approach. But in this particular study, it was volunteers, yeah.
Would those volunteers then be urged to communicate with their colleagues about how valuable this was?
Yeah, there were some, I think, subsequent referrals that were made as the trainings continued. And I think there was, so it was ongoing training that happened. I think they also have started to, I don't know if they have the in-session workshops they had for the staff and faculty, but there's also similar type of online trainings for like college students, for example. And I think they've implemented some of those things to allow students and other staff to have meet a much wider group. Iowa State is also working with the JED Foundation right now to increase sort of our comprehensive response as a university, and they're actually doing some assessments of places where we're strong and places that we can improve on and giving us feedback. So the bystander trainings are one example of some things we've tried, and I think they're trying to implement a more global response across the university.
That was great. So I had a thought while you
Yeah.
were talking, and I thought I would run it by you and get your input. So when you were talking about the self-affirmation model or theory, I do some work with experts, and when experts sometimes do things wrong, like psychologists misdiagnosing people sometimes, along with experts of all other domains. And also I know that sometimes these things are predictable, and we understand why these errors happen. But sometimes professionals, I don't want to pick on psychologists, I am a psychologist, but like lots of domains do this, but professionals are defensive about the procedures that we know could mitigate some of those errors. So I wondered if, with this theory, if with an intervention with professionals, if you were to say boost one of these other in some kind of intervention, if it might reduce their resistance.
In theory, yes. So anything that impacts their identity, and so actually the stronger they identify with the role, and the more central it is, right, the harder it's going to be to get feedback that counteracts that. When I do a lot of training, I do a lot of training of like beginning counselors. And one of the biggest things I do is actually do attempts to lessen their anxiety and talk about their strengths before I give them any feedback around changes, because they come in and want feedback around the changes. In this case, though, the professionals may not want feedback around the changes, but it's very hard to actually hear it and accept it, and even to see what our potential is. Until some of those anxieties and some of those fears of, for beginning counselors, is often like fears of like being an imposter or not having the skills. It may be a little flipped for a professional, whereas they also feel too confident and aren't willing to approach sort of the things they need to improve on. But still, anything that's wrapped up to our identity and something we want to be really good at or really important to us is going to be hard to hear feedback that counteracts that or is negative that. So the example I gave, if you wanted to give me feedback about the talk, it's going to be easier to hear afterwards, right? Because I just gave the talk. I want it to have gone really well. If you told me it stunk, that's going to be a real shock right away. But if we were able to remind me of those other things, put a little distance, and then I got the feedback, I'll be much more accepted to it. So I think the theory should hold, even if the situation is slightly different.
really enjoyed the talk, and I really liked the affirmation part. I make referrals to students for counseling frequently, and I use affirmations in my training of counselors, and that's a great reminder to use that in making referrals for students for counseling. Great suggestion. I really love that. I'm just hoping you can help me to put my big picture together on something. I hear a lot, mostly in popular press, sometimes in reading book chapters, about the popularity of counseling and therapy for young adults. And I'm wondering if that is in fact factual and is part of the increase in services. You talked about, help seeking going up, but you also talked about that group not being particularly high in the decrease in stigma, that's more in older adults. If you can help me put that together.
So older adults on average have lower levels of stigma. But there may be some, they talk about some like generational shifts. So on one hand, older generations probably on average have more stigma. But over time, we also are less worried about sort of external and more worried about internal. So there may be sort of an initial higher bar, but it kind of lessens sort of our concerns about what other people are doing. And it then much more becomes just concern about my internal going on. Younger generations probably are much more impacted by what's going on around them, but also maybe less likely to internalize it a little bit. And so there could be a little protective factor there, increasing some of the service use. If you take it globally, that's probably true that it may be a slightly higher use among younger individuals, but it's also a little more nuanced in that it might depend upon the area. And so there might be certain locations, like on the coasts, where therapy in general is mildly used, and it might be certain places where therapy is more accessible. And so it's a little more nuanced than that, though the overall statistic is probably accurate.
Thank you.
One more question? I'll take that as the last question. How's that? Good. Come on up.
I got feedback for you about the talk. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, okay.
I'm a Hispanic man of color, and I really appreciate talks like yours. I feel like we need to have more of these conversations. So thank you for that and for being vulnerable about the thing about your mom. I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
And with that being said, like, I'm an undergraduate in psychology, and I'm like really interested in the stigma aspect. So what's your advice for me at my undergraduate level if I want to be an active part of the Iowa State community or the community in general to start being part of the change?
Yeah. So I was thinking, again, we need to just look for places where we can have these discussions. And that could be anywhere from starting with just our friends and our family, all the way up to standing on a stage in front of a group of people and talking about it. And I think any range in between, there are student organizations, like there's Student National Alliance for Mental Illness, I think has a student organization on campus. There's a number of other student groups, both in psychology and across campus, focusing on mental health related issues, and have had various interventions or various attempts to bring in speakers. And so I think it's just finding the place that sort of fits sort of what's important to you and a way that you could sort of connect and feel like you're making a difference. But any place where we're having these discussions, talking about this, I think is part of the change. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you too. And that was just a great question to end on, is how can we all be part of the change? So thank you, David. That was a wonderful and very informative and exciting lecture. And please stick around for a little while. We have some goodies for you back here as part of the reception. And David will still be here for a little while to take further questions or chat with you a little bit more. If you enjoyed this lecture tonight, please remember to watch for future events and news about the college on our website, and that's las.iastate.edu. Thank you all again for coming, and have a great evening. And thank you very much, David.